The rain had begun before dawn, a soft, unbroken veil that turned the village road to muted silver and laid a hush upon the fields. The spring market, though modest in its offerings, still gathered folk beneath canvas awnings, their boots sinking slightly into damp earth, their voices hushed out of habit more than courtesy. It was a place where every life was known, where every small change was noted, where gossip traveled more swiftly than any horse or carriage. And on that morning, the whispers had begun before she even approached the stalls. She moved with her shawl pulled close, though not for the cold. It was a simple effort to hide herself, not out of shame for her poverty but for the attention it drew. Her dress was clean but clearly worn, fabric faded at the seams, sleeves mended with careful but visible stitches. Once she had worn silk gloves and rode in carriages lined with velvet. Once her footsteps had been light, her laughter unburdened. She had buried that girl along with her husband, and though no one said it aloud, the town treated her as though she had buried her worth with him too. Her basket was nearly empty. A loaf of coarse bread, a few wrinkled apples. She paused at the stall of the butcher, a barrel-chested man with hands like spades and a voice too large for the space it occupied. She had come to purchase broth bones, nothing more. The elderly couple she visited each morning relied on whatever she could gather, and she refused to let them go hungry, regardless of her own thinning meals. "Good morning," she began softly, her voice steady, polite. The butcher did not return the courtesy. He glanced at her basket, at her worn shoes, at the water-darkened hem of her dress. "Coin first," he said, as though she were known for theft rather than honesty. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and withdrew a small cloth pouch. A few coins clinked quietly into her palm. Not quite enough. She felt the lack like a needle under her ribs. "If you would allow me the bones that won't sell at day's end," she said, trying to keep her voice even, "I will return with payment tomorrow." The elderly couple in the manor on the hill, they. "Oh ho," the butcher cut in, voice sharp. "The manor folk. The Duke's parents. Most curious how you've made yourself indispensable there." A murmur rose from nearby shoppers. It was not admiration. It was suspicion, envy, and the cruel delight of those eager to believe the worst of someone who had once walked above them. She straightened, though every instinct urged her to shrink away. "They're good people. They need help. That is all." "That is all, is it?" the butcher pressed, leaning closer so others might hear. "A young widow, no money, yet she spends her days in the home of the nobility? You expect us to believe there is no trick to it?" The words cut sharper than any blade. People stopped pretending not to watch. One woman covered her smirk behind gloved fingers. A boy whispered to his mother, who pulled him away as though poverty itself were contagious. "I serve them because no one else does," she said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands did. "If charity offends you, then I will find elsewhere." She turned to leave, but the butcher's voice chased her. "You've overstepped your station. That's the truth of it. And expecting special treatment? Shame on you." The final words struck not because they were harsh, but because they found support in the silence around her. No one defended her. No one offered kindness. Not one person said her service was noble or compassionate. They preferred to believe she climbed rather than fell. And then, from beyond the row of stalls, hooves sounded on wet earth. The Duke had returned from his estate rounds only just the previous evening. He had not intended to stop at the market. Yet the sight unfolded before him. Her rigid stance, the butcher's disdain, the spectators' itching curiosity, and something within him stilled. He had seen struggle in many forms across his journeys, but rarely had he seen quiet endurance held with such dignity. He dismounted, his presence drawing attention like gravity itself. The crowd stepped aside without being asked. He did not look at them. His gaze was fixed entirely upon her. She felt him before she saw him, a shift in the air, a hush woven through the rain. When she turned, he stood but a few paces away, tall, composed, his coat dark with mist, his expression unreadable. No one spoke. Not the butcher. Not the watchers. Not even she. The Duke stepped forward, and with deliberate calm, he removed the umbrella from the footman's hand and opened it above her, shielding her from the rain. "You should not stand alone in the storm," he said. His voice was measured, without force or flourish, yet it filled the space as though it had been waiting there all along. Her breath caught, not out of awe but out of the sharp ache of being seen. Truly seen. "My lord," she managed, though her gaze remained lowered, unwilling to appear presumptuous. The butcher bowed his head, suddenly remembering respect. Others followed, like reeds bending with the wind. But the damage had already been done. The shame had already wrapped itself around her like icy thread. The Duke looked briefly at the butcher, then at the others. No anger, no scolding, just a silence that felt heavier than admonishment. He offered her his arm, not as savior or superior, but as an equal gesture of escort. She did not take it. Her pride stood as her final possession. "I thank you," she whispered, though the words trembled with something deeper, an exhaustion of being misjudged, unseen, misunderstood. He inclined his head once, accepting her refusal without injury. The rain softened to a mist. The market resumed its quiet murmurs. Yet something had shifted, something subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. For the first time in a long while, there was witness to her dignity. And witness is where stories begin. The rain did not last beyond the morning, yet its presence lingered in softened earth and the faint scent of wet stone that clung to the village lanes. Life resumed its quiet hum, but something had shifted. The market folk, once comfortable in their certainty of her place in the order of things, now watched her with a new, uneasy curiosity. The Duke's small gesture, no more than a moment's shelter from the rain, had unsettled the balance. People had not known what to make of it, and when they did not understand, they filled the gaps with their own inventions. She continued her visits to the manor on the hill. The elderly couple awaited her each morning with the patience of those who have only companionship left to measure their days. The Duke's mother always greeted her with a smile too genuine to be constrained by rank. The father, though frail and slow of breath, sat taller when she entered the room, as if her presence restored some earlier dignity in him. They were not grand tyrants of aristocratic cuentos. They were simply two old hearts who had outlived their strength. And she warmed their rooms, fed their hands, and spoke to them with the respect of a daughter whose love had not been asked for, but offered freely. The Duke learned of her visits not through servants who would have made a spectacle of it, but through the quiet observation of the manor steward, a man loyal enough to speak truth, even when it did not flatter. The Duke listened, his expression unreadable, absorbing each detail. How she arrived on foot, sometimes through cold wind. How she sang softly while preparing broth. How she mended the old mother's worn shawl without drawing attention to it. There was nothing strategic in her kindness, no audience, no benefit. It was the sort of goodness that the world seldom rewards and frequently punishes. The Duke did not interfere. Not at first. But he began to leave small things behind for his parents. A warmer blanket stitched from thick wool, jars of preserved pears imported from the southern coast, a shawl lined with soft fleece. They arrived without explanation, without crest or seal. The elders thought perhaps the steward was simply more attentive of late. She suspected differently, but she never spoke of it. Some gifts were meant to be received without ceremony. Yet the village did not see tenderness. They saw elevation, opportunity, and suspicion flowered quickly. It began in whispers at the well. "She goes to the manor every morning. Have you seen her since the Duke returned? No woman climbs without purpose." By the week's end, the whispers had coiled into scandal. At the church, where sanctity should have held tongues at bay, young wives spoke behind lace gloves, their eyes bright with unkind delight. "She has her hooks in them, you will see." A widow learns quickly when need demands. She is merely positioning herself. The Duke is a man alone, is he not? She was pretty once. Perhaps she means to be again. The cruelty was not loud. It was the softness of poison placed in teacups, meant to be swallowed slowly to work its way inward. She endured it as she endured all things, with quiet. But her silence did not protect her. Rumor works fastest upon those who refuse to defend themselves. One afternoon she stood outside the chapel after service, sunlight making a pale halo of her shawl. A young woman of the village approached her, a smile sweet enough to sting. "You spend much time at the manor still," she remarked, voice dipped in honey. "One might think you hope to secure your future there." The words were spoken lightly, almost innocently, but the intent glittered sharp beneath. "I go where I am needed," she replied simply. "Yes," the young woman agreed. "So do many." The meaning was clear. The shame was meant to be shared aloud. Before she could respond, the Duke stepped from the shadow of the church gate. He must have heard the exchange. His face bore no anger, only a calm so still it unsettled the small crowd lingering nearby. "Madam," he said to the young woman, his tone courteous yet chilled by unmistakable authority, "your concern for my household is unnecessary." The woman blanched and dropped a hasty curtsy. The Duke did not look at her again. His gaze moved to the widow, softened, but only by the smallest shade of warmth. He did not speak to her, not then. Words would have made the moment heavy when it needed only dignity. Instead he moved past, leaving no grand gesture, no rebuke, no proclamation. only the knowledge that he had seen again. That evening, when she returned to the manor, she found a white camellia resting on the kitchen windowsill. Its petals unfurled like quiet devotion. The flower was neither extravagant nor common. It was the emblem of admiration without expectation. She stared at it for a long time. A part of her wanted to keep it, to treasure it as proof that she was not invisible in the world. But another part, worn from loss, wary of hope, could not bear to be seen reaching for something that might vanish. She placed the camellia gently outside on the stone step. Outside, the evening deepened. The Duke stood a distance away near the garden path, unseen but not unnoticed, watching her silhouette framed in warm lamplight. When she stepped away from the window, he approached the stone step and looked down at the flower, untouched by her hand. He did not retrieve it. He only stood there for a long moment, the quiet settling around him like an unanswered question. The housekeeper, who had watched from behind the half-open pantry door, would later swear she saw something soften in his face, not longing exactly but recognition. Recognition of a woman determined to survive her sorrow without leaning on the strength of another. Recognition of the one thing he had never been able to master in his own heart: restraint. Winter settled over the hills with a quiet that seemed to thicken the very air. Frost clung to branches like clusters of crystal, and the river ran slower, its surface gathering thin skins of ice at the edges. The manor on the hill, though once known for its warm gatherings and generous hospitality, had grown hushed with age and absence. Only a few rooms remained lit now, and the rest of its grand corridors slept in silence. On one such evening, when dusk had barely finished falling and the hearth in the old mother's sitting room glowed with a soft amber warmth, she arrived carrying a basket of broth, bread, and herbs. Her breath misted in front of her as she stepped inside, her shawl dusted with the faint glitter of snow. She shook the cold from her fingers and greeted the elderly couple with the gentle smile that had long since become the comfort of their days. "You return even in this weather," the old father murmured, his voice thin but touched with gratitude. "Snow does not halt necessity," she replied, removing her gloves to warm her hands at the hearth. "And you are no burden. You are simply in need of care, as any person may someday be." The Duke had entered the room quietly. Perhaps he had already been there, perhaps he had just arrived, but his presence was felt before it was seen. She sensed the shift in the air, the way the old mother's eyes brightened, the way the room itself seemed to acknowledge someone of gravity. He did not speak at first. He watched her from the threshold, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. The lamplight caught the planes of his face, sharp, yet softened by something unguarded tonight. He had removed his gloves, his coat now resting on the back of a nearby chair, giving the impression not of a lord visiting his parents, but of a son returned home and weary from the world. She continued spooning broth into the old mother's bowl. Her hands were steady, though she was keenly aware of him. The quiet stretched, but it was not strained. Rather, it was the kind of quiet shared by those who do not need to prove themselves through speech. The old mother spoke, her voice as clear as age allowed. "My son, you should know. This girl has done more to keep me alive than any medicine." The words were spoken simply, without performance, without expectation. The Duke's gaze shifted to his mother, then to the widow kneeling at her side. He stepped forward, slow and measured. "I know." The old mother drifted to sleep soon after, the fire crackling softly as snow tapped at the window glass. The father dozed in his armchair. And as the flames dimmed to a lower amber glow, she rose, intending to depart. But the Duke spoke her name, not loud but sure, the sound of it settling between them like something carefully placed. "Stay a moment if you will." She hesitated, her hand still resting on the back of the chair. Her instinct was to retreat. But retreat did not feel like strength tonight. And so she remained. He moved to the window, hands clasped behind him as he looked out at the snow-covered grounds. "I have spent much of my life believing that I must hold myself apart. That proximity invites expectation, and expectation breeds deceit. I have seen enough of it to know how quickly affection can sour into possession." His tone was steady, not confessional for confession's sake, but in the manner of a man who has weighed every word before offering it. She listened in silence. "When I learned you came here," he continued, "I assumed, perhaps unfairly, that there must be motive. Everyone has motive in society. And yet I discovered there was none. You asked for nothing. You sought no favor. You did not even speak your name to the servants." She inclined her head slightly. "I did not wish your parents to become fodder for gossip. Their dignity deserves protection." He turned then, meeting her eyes fully for the first time that night. "And yours?" She was unprepared for the question. Her breath caught before she could stop it. "My dignity is mine to bear," she answered, though the words came softer than she intended. "I have learned to rely upon no one to defend it." The Duke's gaze shifted, not with pity but recognition. "You carry much alone." "As do many," she replied. "There is no nobility in burden. Only necessity." He stepped closer, not enough to touch her, but enough that warmth filled the space between them. The fire crackled softly, and time seemed to slow into something quiet and fragile. "I have watched you endure cruelty that would have broken others," he said, voice low. "I have seen grace where most would answer in bitterness. And I find myself—" He paused, the restraint of a careful man pressing against the edge of his composure. "I find myself admiring you." The word struck her like the hush before a snowfall, soft but vast. She stared at the fire rather than his eyes. "Admiration is dangerous," she said quietly. "It can be mistaken for affection. And affection, once placed wrongly, can be a ruin." "Then let us speak plainly," he replied, stepping near enough now that the shadow of his hand could have touched hers if either moved even slightly. "I do not offer rescue. I do not offer wealth. I do not offer the false promise of repair. I offer only honesty." Her heart tightened, not from fear, but from the terrifying recognition of wanting to believe him. She met his gaze finally, and in it she saw no claim, no demand. Only a man who had been lonely a very long time. "I cannot be a charity," she whispered. "You are not," he answered. "You are the one thing I have found that is not corrupted by circumstance." The firelight flickered over their hands, so close now that a breath could bridge them. He reached out, not to grasp but to ask. His fingertips touched hers with the gentlest contact, like the beginning of something too tender to name. Her voice was scarcely audible. "Do not look at me as though I am something you could save." His reply was barely above breath. "I look at you as something I wish to know." Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent, patient, unhurried. And the distance between them, carefully guarded, fiercely maintained, had shifted. Not closed entirely, not yet. But altered. Marked. Winter's grip had not loosened, though the sky had cleared. The village lay coated in hard white frost that glittered like powdered glass in the morning light. Yet beneath the beauty something sharp had taken root. Rumors, once muttered in corners, now traveled openly across thresholds and tavern tables. Compassion had been rewritten as ambition. A widow's quiet grace had been twisted into cunning. And her every step was watched, measured, judged. She felt the shift before she heard the words. Doors that once opened without thought now paused. Greetings shortened. Eyes flicked away rather than met hers. The butcher no longer barked insults. He smiled with the smugness of one who believes his suspicions have been confirmed. And though no one spoke the Duke's name directly, his shadow hung over every whisper. The Duke himself had not changed in manner, though something in him had grown more deliberate. His presence in the manor had become more frequent. He lingered in rooms he once passed through. He listened when she spoke to his mother. He watched the way she adjusted blankets, poured tea, soothed loneliness. Each moment was gentle, restrained. Yet it was precisely that restraint that drew attention. People are more threatened by quiet devotion than open desire. One afternoon, when the sky was the color of pewter and the air carried a bite, she made her way back from the manor, her shawl pulled tight. Snow creaked under her boots. At the village gate, two women stepped deliberately into her path. Their smiles were thin, their intentions sharp. "You must be proud," one said, her voice coated in sweetness that made every word sting. "Few rise so quickly." The Duke's parents, the Duke himself, quite the achievement for one fallen so far. The other leaned in just slightly. "I suppose skill takes many forms. Some women sew. Some cook. Some present themselves strategically." The words struck, not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed what the town now believed. She did not answer. Silence was her only defense, though it offered no protection. When she reached her small home, she found a letter slipped beneath the door. No seal. No signature. Just 2 lines written in a hand meant to injure. "We see you. And soon he will see the truth as well." She read the note once, folded it neatly, and set it in the stove's flame. By the next morning, the storm had broken fully. The village square filled with murmurs, faces turned toward the manor road. She did not know what had happened until she arrived to find the Duke's carriage standing before the chapel, his horse held by a stable boy. People gathered like crows at a field's edge, waiting, eager. The Duke stepped down from the chapel steps. His coat was dusted with snow. His expression was composed, but his eyes held a depth that made the murmurs falter. The widow stood a distance away, but her presence did not go unnoticed. In fact, it was the reason the crowd had formed. A woman from the market, emboldened by audience, lifted her voice. "My lord, we only wish to protect you from being misled." Another added, "It is clear what she seeks. We all see it." The duke's gaze moved across those assembled, slow and piercing. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He simply looked, and the silence grew heavy. "You speak of what you do not know," he said, his tone measured. "You accuse freely, yet you have witnessed nothing but kindness and dignity from the woman you defame." The butcher scoffed aloud. "You think her intentions pure? A widow alone in your home each day." The duke's voice cut through the cold air. "Enough." The word struck like the crack of a rifle. "She has given more than any of you," he continued. "Not for advantage. Not for admiration. She has tended to my parents when I could not. She has shown them warmth this town has not offered her." The crowd shifted uneasily. No one had expected him to speak so plainly. But plain speaking has consequences. The widow's heart pounded, not with pride but with fear. She knew what this would cost him. Reputation was fragile, and once tarnished, it was rarely restored. She stepped forward, though her hands trembled. "My lord," she began, but he turned to her, and his expression softened just enough to still her voice. He spoke for her, not over her. "You owe no explanation. Not to them." Then, louder for all to hear, "This woman owes this world nothing, and yet she gives it everything." The effect was immediate. Murmurs fell to a stunned quiet. The wind tugged at cloaks. A church bell told the hour. But admiration is rarely the response to truth. Suspicion, once rooted, grows deep. Someone whispered, "He protects her because he is already ensnared." Another muttered, "It is done then, he will marry below his station." And in that instant she understood the ruin that would follow, not for her, but for him. She turned and fled before anyone could see the tears gathering in her eyes. Snow stung her cheeks as she ran, her breath breaking in ragged bursts. She did not stop at her cottage. She did not stop at the village gate. She followed the river path, frozen ground crunching beneath her feet, until she reached the place where the water bent beneath a bare oak tree. The Duke found her there, as though he had known where she would run. His boots were silent in the snow, his breath visible in the cold. She did not turn to him. "You should not have spoken," she whispered. "They will destroy you for it." He stepped closer, but not so close as to corner her. "Let them. I will not stand idle while they tear you apart to protect their comfort." "You do not understand," she said, voice breaking. "Once they decide what I am, there is no undoing it." He reached out, not to claim but to offer. His voice was low, steady, undeniable. "Then let me decide who you are." The river moved slow beneath the ice. The world held its breath. And the distance between them narrowed to a fragile, terrifying inch. Snow lay unbroken across the riverbank, white as unspoken truth. The wind had quieted, as though the world itself paused to listen. She stood with her shawl wrapped tight, breath rising in pale ribbons, her gaze fixed on the slow-moving water below. The Duke approached with the same measured step he had always carried, but something in his bearing was changed. Not softer, no, he had never been weak, but unguarded. As though he had laid down armor he once believed necessary for living. She did not turn when he stopped behind her. She feared that meeting his eyes would break something inside her she was not ready to lose. "You should not have followed me," she said, her voice thin but steady. "The town already believes I have taken hold of you. Your presence only feeds the fire." He did not step closer. He respected distance the way some men respected consequence. "Then let them speak," he answered. "They have spoken of you for months. Their tongues are not gentle to begin with. I will not shape my life to accommodate the smallness of others." She closed her eyes, the ache in her chest pulling tight. "This is not about smallness. This is about survival. You may stand against rumor, but I have lived inside its shadow. It devours. It stains. It makes a mockery of dignity." "I know," he replied quietly. His voice held something she had not heard before, weariness. Not of her, but of the world. Of the weight placed upon them both. "I have spent years," he continued, "holding myself apart, believing distance was strength, believing solitude was safety. But I have watched you, day by day, give warmth without request, patience without reward, compassion when none was returned to you. And I find that I am tired of a life untouched by meaning." She turned then, and the hurt in her eyes stilled him more effectively than any weapon. "You speak of meaning," she whispered, "but you know nothing of the cost. I have lost before. I have buried a life once. I cannot bear to build another only to watch it be destroyed. His jaw tightened, not with anger but with understanding. I do not ask you to build a life for me. I ask to build one with you. The simplicity of the words struck deeper than grand declarations ever could. Snowflakes drifted between them, slow and unhurried. She shook her head. If you choose me, you abandon expectation. You abandon what society demands of you. They will say you have thrown away your title for a woman who owns nothing. He stepped closer, one careful pace, leaving only a hand's breadth between them. I have spent my life owning everything and feeling nothing. If society would call love a loss, then it is they who have forgotten what it means to be human. Her breath shook. She had fought so long to remain untouched by hope, yet hope now rose in her like thawing earth beneath frost. And if I fail you, she asked quietly, if grief comes again, if the world proves unkind. He lifted his hand, not to command but to invite, and placed it over hers. Their fingers did not entwine, they simply rested, honest, steady. Then we endure, he said. Not as lord and widow. Not as scandal and speculation. But as two souls who have already survived more than most. She had not realized tears had gathered until the cold wind traced them down her cheeks. But you will lose standing, she whispered. I will gain peace, he answered. For a long moment neither moved. The river flowed. The world held its breath. Finally she exhaled, slow and trembling, not in surrender but in acceptance. Then walk with me, she said. Not ahead. Not behind. Beside. The faintest, barely there, smile touched his mouth. Not triumphant. Not relieved. Simply real. Beside, he repeated. They walked back together along the river path, steps aligned. The village came into view, its chimneys trailing thin columns of smoke. And though the whispers had not ceased, people always watch what they do not understand, their tone shifted as the pair passed. The Duke did not release her hand, though he did not hold it tightly. It was not a display. It was a declaration, quiet, unwavering, undeniable. When they returned to the manor, the old mother, wrapped in blankets by the fire, looked up with a knowing softness. The father raised his head with slow effort, his eyes warming, not in surprise but in approval. Home did not always look like grandeur. Sometimes it looked like being seen. In the days that followed, the scandal did not disappear. But it faded, not from forgetfulness, but because conviction has a weight that gossip cannot outweigh. People began to see what had always been true. The widow's kindness had never been ambition. The Duke's affection had never been a whim. It was patience meeting patience. Strength recognizing strength. Loneliness finding its echo. Spring crept slowly across the valley, melting the snow in gentle increments. The first lily buds appeared along the manor path, small, determined, untouched by winter's bitterness. She knelt to tend them one morning, her hands steady, her heart unguarded. The Duke stood nearby, speaking quietly with the steward about growing new orchards beside the river in the coming season. When he finished, he crossed to her side and knelt with the same grace he had shown since the beginning, not claiming, not fixing, simply joining. You chose to stay, she murmured. No, he replied, a warmth in his gaze that reached her fully now. I chose to begin. Their hands brushed in the soil, in the soft promise of a new season. And from that gentle touch, a life unfolded, not grand, not perfect, but deeply, quietly whole.